Hello, and welcome to Archives and Records Simplified. These videos are aimed at people looking for basic knowledge about archives and records management, although at times I will also touch slightly on information and library science. These videos are designed to provide bite-sized chunks, which means that almost every video will be less than 15 minutes. These videos are honestly for everyone, and comments and suggestions are always more than welcome. About me, Sean Macmillan, I'm an archivist based in London, and you can learn more about me via my LinkedIn profile, to which there is a link posted below. And I'll also post a transcript and notes also if you struggle at any point to understand my accent. And lastly, if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could kindly like, subscribe and share. Thanks again. Alright, so this video relates more to the softer skills and general working conditions. Okay, so quick overview. A few weeks ago, I published a video where I talked about some of the skills that employers tended to look for in job applications, and I admitted outright that one of the things I did in that video was I hadn't looked too much at the sort of softer skills that employers tended to request, even though they're quite important. And there was a few people that asked me to speak a little bit more about this. I think these kind of skills are maybe often overlooked, including by me, and I'm going to go through some examples and maybe give some examples and recommendations. One thing I would say is that this video is a little bit more specific to archivists, and also these aren't exhaustive, only a snapshot. If you have any questions or you're unsure about anything, please feel free to ask for more details. Okay, so one thing that comes up in almost every job description relating to archivists and likely records managers too is attention to detail. This is absolutely critical for many tasks you undertake, quite often cataloguing or digitization. And it's also worth saying that a lot of archival work in particular can often be quite repetitive. That is to say, you might be doing the same task several hours a day, several days in a row. The best advice I can give here is to try develop a system. So if, for example, you're updating several hundred physical shelf marks within a collection, I would work on a program of work where you aim to do so many per hour with time for spot checks and review. So you may aim to update 40 per hour and then 10 minutes reviewing and then 10 minutes extra if you need it for anything else. It's very easy to make a small mistake in these kind of tasks, and that leads me to my second piece of advice. You'll often find that certain errors are more common than others, and if you notice one, I would check for similar mistakes. So sometimes, for example, if you're, say, proofreading one of your catalogues and you notice that you've accidentally expressed a date range wrong, sometimes it's similar that you've made similar mistakes elsewhere in a catalogue. That's something I've tended to find anyway. Lastly, where possible, see if there's a technological option you can use. For example, if you're updating a set of fields in a catalogue all at once, then maybe consider something like the replace all type function, but I'd always be very careful before updating several thousand records at a time. In this instance, I probably would once again recommend things like balance and checks, which might include practicing in a small sample set first, spot checking a few examples at the end, and also saving a copy first. Okay, so a little bit more about the sort of people skills that are common in the archive sector. So almost all jobs these days require some aspect of being able to work with other human beings and to interact with people generally. However, a few sort of specific areas to archivists, I would say, are working with users and working with donors. So by users, I mean people who come into a repository to see archival materials, who would in many respects be visiting a reader room, a reading service. One of the key skills I'd say here you would need is listening skills. Often when you're speaking to readers, sometimes they'll know very much what they want and they've requested it beforehand. But sometimes they're not always so sure. Sometimes their requests can be a bit vague and they might be speaking to you over the phone, in which case you need to listen carefully. You're probably more likely to receive a request by email, in which case you need to read a bit more closely. But just generally be observant and try understand what it is exactly they're looking for. The other thing I would say is try know your collections and your institution as well as possible. Often you'll be asked questions that you maybe don't have the answer to on the spot. And the more knowledge you can have of where you work, the better place you will be to answer those questions. And lastly, I would say also maybe think about reasonable ways you can maybe improve accessibility. For example, I remember working on a research project a few years ago, and there was an archive very far away which had some materials I was interested in seeing, and the archivist there was very kind enough to digitize it and send over a copy. That's just one example. Another example might be for people with disabilities, or maybe anyone who might struggle to access your collection in another way. One thing I would say just generally, I think it's good to think about ways you can make your collections and you can make your institution more accessible to a wider range of people. Okay, so the second one, working with donors. The first thing I'd say is remember that, oh sorry, I should probably define donors first. So by donors, I mean people who are donating archival materials to an institution. Sometimes they might approach you or you might approach them. And the first thing I would say is that sometimes this can be a deeply personal experience. Often people might be giving you materials that's very close to them, or in some cases it may be their family that's donating the materials, especially if it's from a sort of personal collection. And it's also true that donors, a bit like users, can often have different ideas of what an archive is, and it's best to be as clear as this as possible. Obviously there are differences between archives and libraries, or archives and museums work, and I think it's very important to be as clear about this as possible. And lastly, I would say that in any sort of situation when working with donors, I would always recommend keeping good notes and keeping a note of written correspondence where possible. It's always good to have that to go back to and have something to reference long term. If you are ever working with a donation, it can take months to go through. In fact, in my experience, they very rarely happen overnight. So keeping notes and keeping a note of the correspondence over the long term can be a real advantage. And lastly, just to sort of maybe mention what I said a few seconds ago, that donors and readers rarely have archival training, and what might be obvious to you is not always so to them. And it's also worth thinking, I'm not always sure that archival catalogues, in terms of how they're hierarchical, I'm not sure that's always as clear to non-archivists personally. So it's just something to think about. Okay, so working alone and solo working. So at the other end of the spectrum is working alone. And I would say this is very common if you're working in an archival position. Um, it's probably a lot more common if you don't work in a big institution. So if you're the only archivist in your institution, then it's definitely very common. If you work at one of the bigger libraries or one of the bigger universities, then you might not have this as much, although it's still possible. So the first thing I would say here is it's probably a good idea to try create some sort of structure. And this might include having deadlines to meet, make schedules for your days, and setting targets. The other thing I would say is maybe try set objective standards where possible. So when I say objective, I mean things that you can actually measure. So if you're working, say, in a digitization project, you may aim to have digitized so many records by the end of a certain day. That's a bit more objective than something a bit more qualitative. So if you can measure it, if you can measure your goals and deadlines, I think that's always going to make life a little bit easier. I'd also say that if you are working alone, or you're working in a sort of isolated role, I would say maybe try get out of your head where possible, such as lunch times, etc. Obviously the COVID situation means that a lot of people are working from home, but if you are able to have lunch with someone, or even maybe if you're maybe in a WhatsApp group during your lunch breaks, or you've got some sort of social connection that you can do from home, then I would probably recommend that you try do that every now and then, just so that you're getting some interaction. And lastly, I would also say embrace it. Working alone can also be really, I personally don't mind it. I know some people hate it. I've personally found that sometimes it gives me a chance to really concentrate on my work. And as I say, like, you might actually find that you really enjoy it. Some people, I think, absolutely hate it, and it's not for them. But I've personally grown to not mind it as much. So that's just my advice. Okay, so this is not so much a skill, but it's maybe more something that you might need to think about. It's more of an extension of the last point. Often is the case that you might be the only archivist in an institution. This is less common in big institutions, but quite common, especially in the corporate setting. And I've been in this situation probably about twice in my career. It's never as bad as it seems, and sometimes it can be really good to get a sort of different diversity of viewpoints and experiences. Sometimes you don't want to get too wrapped up in the archival world. It can be good to sort of see what other people are doing and just get a different culture. And what I would say, first of all, is be prepared to accept that the knowledge which is first-hand to you is not to everyone else. So you might find that certain things that are common to you as an archivist isn't so to other people, and you might need to explain it. I would say try learn as much as possible to look for areas of compromise. If you are working in more of the corporate setting, it may be the case that the company's bottom line is a little bit different from what you want to do as an archivist. And the ideal situation would be try to find some area of compromise there. I'd also say that if you're the only archivist at your institution, then make sure you're keeping in touch with networks such as the listserv and ARA to stay in contact with the sector. I would also say use guidance when making recommendations. That can be really helpful. So for example, if you're working at a university or a big institution, you'll probably find that there's already mechanisms and mechanics there that allow you to sort of advise and make recommendations based on certain things that may not exist if you're the only archivist in a smaller or less archival institution. So for example, the Digital Preservation Coalition offer fantastic advice in advocating for digital preservation. If you were the only archivist at that institution and you were making that case, I would look at guidance documents like that to help you. And also lastly, and again, if you're working a little bit more in a corporate setting, is you might need to think a little bit more economically at times, especially with sort of corporate archives. It might be seen that archives as something that is costing a lot of money, but it's not generating any revenue, and it may be at times where you have to sort of justify the sort of expensive things. Okay, and lastly, some general technical skills. So obviously technical skills are quite common in the vast majority of workplaces, but a few may be a bit more specific to the archives world. The first thing I would say is that it would be good to get as comfortable as possible with different types of content management software. So especially if you're working in cataloguing roles, you'll often find that you'll be using software such as CamAxial, ICA Atom, AdLib, etc. You'll tend to find that that's a key component in your role. And the more comfortable you are with these sort of softwares and being able to sort of add, delete, and edit records, your life will be much easier. The second one I would say is, it wouldn't be the worst thing to be comfortable with digitization and Photoshop software. I was very lucky in the sense that I was able to do a digitization module as part of my master's, and that's a really useful course to do. But being able to understand how to create images and to edit them, that's one area where I think there's maybe a little bit of growth, and that's something I would recommend knowing a bit more about. And lastly, I think general Microsoft packages like Excel, which is often used for for box lists, Microsoft Word, which is used for any regular number of tasks such as creating documents, and Microsoft Outlook, including being able to create a calendar, etc. I would say it would do you well to understand these softwares also. And lastly, I would just generally make a tip that learning the technology as early as possible can be a really, really huge advantage. As I say, it can, if you don't understand how to work something or how to set something up, it can literally turn a 5-minute task into something that lasts a lot longer. So, as I say, understanding the technology as early as possible can be a big advantage, and I thoroughly recommend it. So anyway, I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you have any comments or questions, I would be more than delighted to hear them. Thanks again. And if you enjoy these videos, I would be extremely grateful if you could like, subscribe and share. And also just to remind you that I would be absolutely delighted to take any requests for future videos also.